We will not stay silent. I have a message for the people of Iran. The United States hears you. The United States supports you. The United States is with you. That's part of the message of U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo when peaceful protests against a decision by Iran's government to increase the price of gasoline turned violent after rioters took advantage of the protests to carry out acts of sabotage in some cities, such as attacking public and private buildings. The U.S. Special Envoy for Iran, Brian Hook, admitted that Washington was working to promote anti-government moves through providing what he called workarounds. In tonight's debate, we'll discuss why the U.S. is seeking to destabilize Iran. But first, let's watch a background report.
Iranians staged new rallies on Friday to denounce acts of violence and vandalism during the recent anti-government protests in the country. The crowds condemned Israel, Saudi Arabia, and the U.S. for fueling unrest and chanted slogans to vent their anger at Washington for creating chaos in Iran. The anti-government demonstrations began last week, that after the administration of President Hassan Rouhani announced a rationing of gasoline and price hikes in line with its economic reform, saying that it would use the revenues to assist the needy. The protests turned ugly after hooligans and gunmen infiltrated the demonstrations. They say the infiltrators attacked security forces and set fire to public and private property. U.S. officials have voiced support for the violence, with Secretary of State Mike Pompeo threatening to impose fresh sanctions on Iran over the issue. Brian Hook, Washington Special Envoy for Iran, also admitted that America is working to promote anti-government moves through providing what he called workarounds. The U.S. stance is reminiscent of a July 2017 report by the New York Times. The report revealed that the Trump administration picked a notorious undercover agent that the American Daily named Michael D'Andrea, or the Dark Prince, to run the CIA's Iran operations in a bid to advance the White House's anti-Tehran agenda, including regime change. Iran has also blamed UK-based Persian media outlets for inciting the unrest, with Iran's ambassador to the UK, Hamid Bahidinejad, filing a complaint against them with Ofcom. Iran has seen anti-government protests over the past decades over economic and political issues. Officials say people have every right to hold peaceful protests, but will spare no effort to prevent acts of violence which lead to instability and insecurity in the country.
Joining us on tonight's debate, we have Executive Director of the Ron Paul Institute, Daniel McAdams, joining us from Lake Jackson, Texas. Also, former U.S. Senate Foreign Policy Analyst James Jatras is joining us from Washington, D.C. Gentlemen, welcome to the program. Let's start off with our guest in Lake Jackson, Mr. Daniel McAdams. Mike Pompeo was quick to say that the U.S. supports the Iranian people. That doesn't make sense when the U.S. sanctions are directly hurting the same people en masse. Isn't the U.S.'s claim of support a bit hypocritical?
Well, he supports some of the Iranian people, the people that are burning things and blowing things up, just like he supports the people in Venezuela and Bolivia, etc., who are burning up their countries. The idea that the U.S. supports the people is absurd because, as you point out, the sanctions, the U.S. aggression toward Iran, that's been ongoing since '79, and certainly you could go back to '53, certainly belies his statements of support for the people.
James Jatras, it's no secret that the U.S. and Israel want to destabilize Iran. Washington's withdrawal from the 2015 nuclear agreement and the imposition of the most stringent sanctions ever on Iran also seek to achieve that goal. What's your opinion on the issue?
Well, I think the key words here are maximum pressure, that the policy we're pursuing against Iran is maximum pressure, as it is against North Korea, as it is against Venezuela. There are two possible outcomes to such a policy, it seems to me. One is that you pressure the opponent into coming back and making a deal. And sometimes you hear from this administration, that's what we really want to do with Iran. There have even been little hints that maybe that Trump meet with President Rouhani like he has met with Chairman Kim in North Korea. On the other hand, the other possible outcome of maximum pressure is to destabilize a country, cause its economy to collapse, and to have a regime change. That's what we're trying to do in Venezuela, where we've even recognized Mr. Guaido as the real president, not the elected president, Mr. Maduro. It's unclear what the path forward is for Iran. I tend to think they have more in mind regime change, collapse, civil strife, and then some entity will come forward, maybe led by the terrorist group MEK, we can install like we did in Iraq, and this even could involve war. The sad fact is that with Trump facing impeachment, whatever his intentions are don't really matter. He's a pathetic little figurehead at this point. I don't even think he can proceed with his preferred policy on North Korea, and who knows what he would actually prefer with Iran. Right now, I think we're in full regime change mode, no matter, and inflicting as much misery on the Iranian people as we can is integral to that path.
Danny McAdams, let's further go into the current U.S. administration's Iran policy. The Trump administration picked a notorious undercover agent that was later known to be Michael D'Andrea to run the CIA's Iran operations. He's known as the Dark Angel, or quote-unquote Ayatollah Mike. Who is Michael D'Andrea?
Well, I should start by saying, he's a figurehead. He's the one who's in charge of regime change in Iran. But that position is shared widely in Washington among Republicans and Democrats. So we should definitely focus on someone like him, that he's only a symptom of the problem. But he's the kind of guy that goes and specializes in regime change. He was in charge of the U.S. drone policy, which killed hundreds, if not thousands, of innocent people. He oversaw the torture program of the CIA in the early days of the war on terror. So he's the kind of guy that goes around in the shadows and messes things up, messes countries up. And he's in charge of Iran. He's the point man for regime change in Iran. But again, as I said, this is a position that's widely shared in Washington, from the neocons to the neoliberals, even libertarians. So it's only a symbol of something deeper.
James Yatras, what can you tell us about Michael D'Andrea and what the appointment of this individual says about the Trump administration's policy on Iran?
I don't know him personally, but I know people who do know him personally. As I understand it, he's a convert to Sunni Islam, that he views Iran through a sectarian lens, in addition to all the other things that Daniel mentioned. I think this is simply another evidence of the kind of policy we have here in the United States and have had for decades that has nothing to do with the American national interest, nothing to do with the safety or the prosperity of the American people, but it is simply a grab bag for a bunch of other interests abroad, whether they're Israeli or Saudi or Ukrainian or whoever else they might be, or for the various arms industries and the other corporate actors and the apparatus of the U.S. government itself. As Daniel says, D'Andrea is kind of a figurehead, but he's a guy who is perhaps representative of that kind of mentality.
Danny McAdams, the controversial U.S. ambassador to Germany, Richard Grenell, also came out in support of the protests. He was reported as saying that we cannot give details of what we have done so far in Iran. Why is the U.S. so fixated on galvanizing unrest in Iran?
Because that's how you overthrow countries. You destroy the country first. The same thing is happening in Bolivia. They tried to do it in Venezuela. In fact, the same person involved in Bolivia, Michael Kozak, was the U.S. ambassador to Minsk in Belarus during the Denim Revolution. So these guys make their career. There's no regime change at the State Department. It's always the same people who go from country to country, destabilizing and destroying these countries. There has never been a successful the people, in other words, the people have never come out better after they've been liberated by Washington. So that's why so many people are hesitant in Iran. There are so many counter-protesters, people in Venezuela, hundreds of thousands in the street against the coup. And of course, they're never covered on the free press in the United States.
James Yatras, your thoughts on the same question as, excuse me, as to why the United States is fixated on galvanizing these unrests in Iran?
I obviously, as I say, I think that the goal is regime change, and they will want to get there by hook or by crook, even risking war, possibly even willing to start a war to that end. Although I hesitate to suggest that they're that reckless, but one really doesn't know. I think that I think this varies from region to region. Like, for example, one reason I think we are a little less reckless with regard to North Korea is because South Korea and Japan don't want a war, whereas with respect to Iran, Israel and Saudi Arabia would be rather comfortable with a war and are insistent on regime change. Remember, Donald Trump ran on a platform of America first. We haven't gotten America first, at least with regard to the Middle East. We've got Israel and Saudi Arabia first, which really means that Bibi Netanyahu and Mohammed bin Salman are the beneficiaries of our policy, which has nothing to do with the American people.
Danny McAdams, earlier this month, Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan said that, quote, he knows who is behind the recent unrest in Iraq. Erdogan warned that, quote, our analysis points to the fact that spreading the protests into Iran is on their agenda. What's your reaction to those comments coming from the Turkish president?
Well, I don't think there's any question that the U.S. is heavily involved in the protests in Iraq, despite what some people may say, even what some libertarians may say. It's very, very evident that the U.S. Would like to have a regime change in Iraq as well. There's a lot of pressure on the Iraqi government to get rid of get rid of the U.S. and this occupation of Iraq that's proceeded for 16 years now. The U.S. doesn't like that. Plus, as you point out, the main target is Tehran, is an overthrow in Iran. What we're seeing in Lebanon today is just another part of this larger sort of destabilization picture. And the idea that you're going to eliminate Hezbollah, which has broad support in Lebanon, you're going to eliminate the Iran-friendly militias in Iraq and Syria is a fallacy, is a fantasy. But they don't care because there's nothing to lose. As Jim said earlier, this is an area, just like in Bolivia, the U.S. doesn't care what happens because everyone around them wants a war.
James Yatra, same question to you as well. The Turkish president speculated that he knows who is behind the recent anti-establishment uprising in Iraq, and in his words, they probably plan to spread the protests into Iran. These are noteworthy comments, especially when you have the timing of them in mind.
One has to really think of the irony here. We invaded Iraq in 2003 to bring democracy to the people of Iraq so they can have elections. And when they have elections and put in a government that we think is a little too friendly with the Iranians and doesn't want American troops there, oh, no, that's not that kind of democracy. We don't want that kind of democracy. We want the democracy that favors our point of view. So then if the government there needs to be destabilized, well, let's lend a hand, because after all, it's for a good cause. Obviously, when a government is in a difficult circumstance with popular protests representing some portion of the population, but not others, you do wonder what the outside interference is and in what form, how significant it is, how much is really just from local points of view. I mean, we know, for example, in places like Kiev in 2015, when we had 2014, when we had snipers in the Dnipro hotel shooting at both sides, and the people knew that there was a clear provocation to inflame the circumstance, to legitimate the regime change. I don't know what kind of agents or provocateurs are active in Iraq or Iran and other countries, but I think we can bet that they are there in some form.
Danny McAdams, today's rallies in Iran saw the condemnation of elements that intended to stoke violence in the country following the recent gas price demos. Let's talk more about who you think these foreign elements are and what they're trying to achieve by invoking violence and fueling tensions in Iran.
Well, this is the blueprint for regime change, and as Jim points out, we saw it in Ukraine when you had snipers shooting at both sides. I heard reports in Iran yesterday that there are snipers and helicopters shooting at people. Remember in 2009, the so-called Green Revolution in Iran, which of course was stage managed in Washington, also had snipers. That is a way to terrify the population and mobilize people against the government. So, this is a pattern that continues. But Jim, you talked about democracy a little earlier, and it's interesting. We learned from WikiLeaks that Hillary Clinton once said, "Yeah, we should probably have an election in Palestine Palestinian territories, but we need to find out who's going to win first. So that's how the U.S. brings democracy to the rest of the world. We see it in Bolivia, where the U.S. has told the self-proclaimed Bolivian government now that they can't allow the previous president, who was ousted in a coup, can't be allowed to compete in the upcoming democratic elections. The same thing happened in Egypt, of course, when a government was freely and fairly elected there that the U.S. didn't like. We supported the overthrow and called it a restoration of democracy. So, yeah, democracy is what Washington says it is, and I think the rest of the world is not so stupid that they don't recognize the utter hypocrisy. And that just brings us back to what Jim said. This goes against our national interest. This is against America first, for us to be seen as liars throughout the rest of the world. It's very dangerous.
Mr. Jatros, would you like to add anything to that? As we know, the Iranian president, he said Iranians had defeated an enemy conspiracy against them and against the nation. I'd like to elaborate on those comments for us as well and what enemies he's talking about.
I think he's referring to the obvious culprits, the United States, Israel, Saudi Arabia, and I'm not in a position to say to what extent those countries and other countries are active and in what form they're active, but I think it would be very naive to believe that they don't have their thumb in the pie somewhere. The other thing I would add to the reasons behind stoking this kind of violence is that it forces the government to respond. And this happens, whether you like the government, don't like the government in any given country, we see this over and over again, where if you can provoke a certain level of violence on the street, the government either needs to take firmer action, in which case you can wave the bloody shirt and point to them and say, ooh, look how oppressive they're being. We better really hit them with the sanctions because they're just gratuitously killing their people. Or if the government doesn't do that, they back down and allow themselves to be forced out of office, as happened in Ukraine in 2014. So it's sort of a damned if you do, damned if you don't. If you're faced with that kind of violence on the street, and then the government either has to capitulate or take actions which will then justify further assaults from the outside, including the possibility of military force.
Danny McAdams, Mr. Jatros mentioned the Israeli regime. He also mentioned Saudi Arabia. How would these foreign elements benefit from unrest in Iran?
Well, Israel wants to get rid of all of their so-called enemies in the Middle East, and they would like to fight to the very last American and to the very last American dollar. The same is true with Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is in our favor because they spend billions of dollars buying useless weapons that they don't even know how to operate, can't even protect their own oil fields. In fact, we have to send now 3,000 Americans on guard duty to rich Saudi Arabia, abuse American soldiers to guard the Saudi oil fields because they don't know how to guard it themselves. So this is they benefit because they want to get rid of an enemy and they want someone else to do the heavy lifting for them.
James Jatros, also the Iranian president, stated that the wave of violence, not the protests, but the violence was plotted by the U.S. And Israel. Do you see it in that light as well as the president has stated?
I cannot say to what extent it was plotted by those governments. Certainly those governments have, as I say, a thumb in the pie. How significant that is in the overall picture, I don't know. Remember, it's, to a great extent, the sanctions themselves and the economic dislocation and pain inflicted on the population will also stimulate violence and protests from the people, and that's what it was designed to do. How much other activities from these governments and other governments are involved directly, I'm not in a position to say.
Mr. Jatros, it's interesting you mentioned the issue of sanctions. We had a question earlier for Daniel McAdams about Mike Pompeo, who was quick to voice his opinion on events in Iran. He expressed his support for the Iranian people in his own words. As we mentioned, that does sound inconsistent, and it doesn't make sense when the sanctions, which many are calling economic terrorism, that the U.S. has enacted upon Iran is directly hurting the Iranian people.
Well, I think the word is hypocrisy. It's cold-blooded, brutal hypocrisy. The classic, of course, is Madeleine Albright being asked about the deaths of 500,000 Iraqi children. Is it worth it? She said, yes, we think it's worth it. She then tried to walk it back later. These are crocodile tears, where basically they inflict this kind of harm. Medicines can't be used, and this is in dozens of countries where we inflict these sanctions, which are a form of warfare. It's kind of a modern form of medieval siege warfare, where the most vulnerable parts of the population, children, sick people, old people, poor people, pay the price. They die, they get sick, and then governments that are inflicting the sanctions, sadly, ours leading the way, sit back and say, isn't that sad? Look how these people are suffering, and look what their government is doing to them. It is rank hypocrisy, and it's a war crime. It really is a war crime. And the fact that most Americans don't really know what is being done in their name is itself a crime.
Daniel McAdams, when we look at the comments coming from the likes of Mike Pompeo, Brian Hook, Richard Grenell expressing support for the Iranian people, it seems, by the opinion of many, utterly fanciful to think that Iranians could in any way rely on the support, on the expression of support from these individuals that are in the United States.
Well, a small group will be able to, and those are the people who will betray their country. I'm sure there are a lot of generals in Bolivia right now who are living high off the hog. They went to the school of the Americans and learned how to overthrow their government if need be, and now they're reaping the money. But you mentioned Pompeo and his admonitions to the Iranian people. He wants more violence, and this is what Jim said earlier about how more violence, they want to have violence on the side of the government against the protesters. Pompeo himself said today to the protesters, please send us your pictures of the police crackdown so we can see it and show it off here and have additional sanctions. So they want to be able to show the Iranian government crackdown. Of course, if you had a protest in Washington, D.C. with 1/1000th the level of violence that they have in any of the protests in Iran, you better believe that there would be a crackdown, there'd be heads cracked. I mean, people are shot in the U.S. for selling cigarettes, strangled to death for selling cigarettes by the cops. So, we don't brook any kind of dissent against our own government, but we certainly encourage it overseas.
James Jatras, your final thoughts on the issue?
I have to say that I think this is another instance where we're going down a very ominous road here. Many of us had hoped that Donald Trump would change the dynamic of American policy. He has either been unwilling or perhaps unable to do that. I think he's at this point just a figurehead. The deep state is doing what it does, what it's done for decades, what it's done in many other countries. And for them, this is just one game. This is the way they operate. This is what they do. And they think they're the masters of the universe. And my fear is at some point, something very, very bad is going to happen, and not just with regard to Iran.
All right, I'd like to thank my guest for tonight's program, Executive Director of the Ron Paul Institute, Daniel McAdams, joining us from Lake Jackson, Texas, and also former U.S. Senate Foreign Policy Analyst James Jatras joining us from Washington, D.C. Gentlemen, thank you for contributing to the program, and also special thanks to you, our viewers, for joining us on tonight's debate. Goodbye, everybody.